There is only one way of improving the Agīkūyū, and that is wipe them out.
Those are the words of the colonial administrator Francis George Hall when he was in charge of the Kikuyu district between 1893 to 1900 at Fort Smith. Welcome to today's video. Stick around to the end to see how Agīkūyū people resisted colonial domination by the British Empire for over 14 years between the years 1890 to 1904. When the Imperial British East Africa Company arrived in Agīkūyū land in the late 19th century, they encountered a proud and fiercely independent people. The Agīkūyū were determined to defend their lands, their culture, and their way of life against encroaching colonial forces. The British used these companies or capitalism to colonize the people in their indigenous lands by outsourcing imperial expansion to profit-driven companies like the British East India Company. These companies exploited resources, labor, and markets in the colonies to maximize profits, often through harsh and exploitative practices. Colonization was treated as a business, with indigenous lands commodified and local economies restructured to serve British interests. This minimized government costs and risks while embedding economic exploitation into colonial rule. This strategy fueled Britain's industrial growth but caused displacement, economic dependency, and societal disruption in the colonized regions, leaving a lasting legacy of inequality and exploitation.
1890, the company arrives in Agīkūyū land, chapter number 1.
The first significant encounter occurred in the year 1890 when Frederick Lugard established Fort Dagoretti, known locally as Kiawariua. Lugard, who was Ibiako pointman in East Africa, established this fort in the area that was on the southern border of the Agīkūyū territory and enters into a blood brotherhood and peace treaty with Muthamaki Waiyaki wa Hinga. This marks the first formal contact between the Agīkūyū and the expanding British Empire, though there had been prior contact with a few European explorers, aka Empire Scouts, and Swahili traders. After this treaty, Lugard leaves for Uganda, leaving his subordinate George Wilson in charge of Kiawariua station. Wilson lacked the necessary leadership skills as his senior Lugard, and therefore did not have the firmness required to control his troops and manage relations with the local Agīkūyū population. Wilson's troops engaged in activities such as stealing, pillaging, harassing the Agīkūyū women, and becoming involved in local disputes, which angered the Agīkūyū because this was not part of the agreement they had done with Lugard. The Agīkūyū retaliated by doing the following: waylaying company employees, besieging the fort, ambushing and killing some askaris while they were fetching water from rivers. After the Agīkūyū realized that these tactics did not work in driving out the company from Dagoretti, they decided to burn down the fort to the ground and get rid of the company menace once and for all from their southern territory. After the fort was burned down, the company decided to evacuate the Kiawariua station in Dagoretti in June 1891 under the leadership of George Wilson to Machakos, where they had already set up a station before venturing into Agīkūyū land. While Wilson was on his way to Machakos, he met a caravan headed by a Biako companyman called Leith, who happened to be on his own punitive expedition to punish the Akamba people. George Wilson asked for some reinforcement and was given a few askaris to try and retake the Kiawariua fort, but wasn't successful. Even after receiving reinforcements, he had to abandon the fort and go back to Machakos. In late 1891, the company decided not to send George Wilson for a third time because the situation at Kiawariua was too volatile and his leadership had proven to be ineffective. And so, the company chose a different approach due to the difficulty in dealing with Agīkūyū. So, instead of sending Wilson back, they opted to establish a new fort under a different leadership of Pakis and Eric Smith. The company returned to the area before the end of 1891 with a strong force and defiantly pitched their tents in Waiyaki's Hinga at Bugushi, till the new fort on which Captain Smith bestowed his own name was completed. This fort was built on the site where Lugard had first camped overlooking Waiyaki's village. After this, the company at Fort Smith, under the leadership of Pakis, since Smith had left for Uganda, decided to increase its punitive raids against the Agīkūyū in the surrounding area, with the primary goal of subduing them. This continued until an incident where a company employee called Maktubu was killed. This led to an escalation of hostilities until Pakis called for a truce. Waiyaki, being the Muthamaki of the area, decided to honor the peace treaty. This is because of the Agīkūyū philosophy of peace or thayo. So, under the false pretense of peace, Waiyaki, without the backup of his soldiers, entered Fort Smith to try and reduce hostilities with the company. It was at this meeting that the leader of the station, Pakis, with the help of his soldiers, overpowered Waiyaki and accused him as being the leader of the Agīkūyū resistance, and the death of the company employee Maktubu. Pakis and the company were ignorant of the Agīkūyū leadership structure and therefore thought that Waiyaki was a paramount chief of the Agīkūyū, and so by arresting and deporting him, the company thought the Agīkūyū resistance would stop. However, Waiyaki was only one of the several influential other Maki, and his authority was limited. He could not control the actions of all Agīkūyū people, and his arrest did not remove the underlying causes of resentment and resistance. In August 1892, after the arrest of Waiyaki at Fort Smith, he is marched towards the coast to be exiled. But on his way, he is killed by one of the company agents en route to Mombasa at Kibwezi. This is because Waiyaki resisted to be marched to exile. That is when the company decided to get rid of him once and for all by killing him and burying him at Kibwezi. This event was a major turning point in the relationship between the Agīkūyū and the British Empire, and any hope of peace between the two parties was extinguished. Between 1892 and 1893, intermittent war continues between the Agīkūyū and the company. After the death of Waiyaki, the Agīkūyū decided to lay siege to the fort, and the leader of the fort, Pakis, became isolated, with the Agīkūyū controlling the surrounding area, making him effectively a prisoner within Fort Smith. In January 1893, the Agīkūyū attempt to storm Fort Smith, and Pakis is forced to seek help from the company man called Ainsworth at Machakos Station. The fort is besieged. Ainsworth sends additional troops and equipment which relieves the company, but they were not able to gain control of the area.
Francis Hall and the Kabete Campaigns, Chapter Number 2.
In October 1893, Francis Hall arrived at Fort Smith and becomes a key figure in subduing the Agīkūyū. Hall succeeds another companyman who was in charge of Fort Smith for a short time and was also a poor leader as his troop had mutinied just before Hall took over. He became the superintendent of Fort Smith in Kabete and was infamous for his brutal, punitive expeditions against the Agīkūyū. Under his command, British forces looted livestock, burnt villages, and killed hundreds of Agīkūyū warriors. Between 1893 to 1895, the company conducted punitive expeditions against the Agīkūyū, storming villages, burning houses, and seizing livestock. Hall continues with these policies, gradually breaking the resistance of the Agīkūyū in the Kabete area. In one notorious campaign, Hall led a raid that captured over 900 sheep and goats while leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. These actions deeply embittered the Agīkūyū people, setting the stage for further conflicts. In the following year, he undertook another 3 major raids in which he looted 190 head of cattle and 4,400 sheep and goats, and at the same time burnt many villages. Hall used various strategies, including using collaborators to break the resistance of the Agīkūyū in Kabete. The famous collaborator being Kinyanjui Wagadhirimu, whom the Agīkūyū had christened Kinyanjui Nugu, whom Hall had described as a loyal companion. All the hardships he inflicted on the Agīkūyū and the brutal nature of his campaigns did little to halt the Agīkūyū resistance. Hall at one time became so frustrated with the resistance that he was encountering that he indirectly advocated for the genocide of the Agīkūyū when he wrote a letter to his father in Britain stating that
there is only one way of improving the Agīkūyū, and that is wipe them out. I should be only too delighted to do so, but we have to depend on them for food supplies.
At the end of 1895, the Kabete region was largely subdued by Hall, with resistance becoming sporadic. The Agīkūyū began working as laborers and servants of the white man. This was mainly due to the locust invasion, which had caused a famine in the Kabete area, leaving them with little choice but to submit. This also marked the end of the company, as Kenya territory was officially handed over to the British government. By 1897, along the southern frontier, the Kikuyu had largely accepted the presence of the white man. This is because Hall had used a multifaceted approach in subduing the people in Kabete area. Between 1897 to 1900, Francis Hall continued his activities of subduing the Agīkūyū. After 7 years at Fort Smith, he was finally able to construct the second station, which was called Mbiri Station, located in the current-day Murang'a County, which was later christened Fort Hall in memory of the star administrator in the British government after he had died of black water fever after coming back from a punitive campaign.
Captain Richard Meinertz Hagen and the Murang'a and Nyeri Campaigns, Chapter Number 3.
After 10 long years, the government realized that it had to change tactics because it took almost 10 years to subdue the Kabete area using the tactics of Francis Hall. The British Empire changed tactic by declaring open warfare on the remaining regions of Metume and Gaki, or as they are currently known today as Murang'a and Nyeri. The British government recruited their own version of Hitler of that time period, who was called Captain Richard Meinertz Hagen, to finally crush any resistance left in the Kikuyu district or any other tribes in the Kenya territory that were proving troublesome to the new colonial government. Captain Meinertz Hagen was uniquely qualified because he was posted from Burma, where British were already doing war atrocities while trying to subdue the Burmese people. The captain believed in using force to achieve quick results and minimize casualties, a mindset that aligned with the colonial government's new strategy. The government needed individuals who would not hesitate to use force and who were willing to be ruthless to establish control. Meinertz Hagen's Kenya diaries reveal his willingness to use aggressive tactics such as the destruction of villages, capturing of livestock, and killing resistors, demonstrating his suitability for this role.
Here's a list of minor Tsagaan punitive raids in Agīkūyū territory. The Maruka Raid.
The Maruka punitive raid of 1902 was taken in response to the brutal murder of a white settler by the Kihomboine people. He claims that the people had dragged the settler to a village near the forest, pegged him to the ground, and wedged his mouth open and then urinated into his mouth until he drowned. According to Tsagaan, the settler had been trying to buy sheep from the Kihomboine people. Tsagaan decided to lead a strong expedition consisting of British officers, Askari, Maasai levies, and Kikuyu collaborators. This is how Tsagaan carried out the ambush on the Kihomboine people. Tsagaan made a night march to the village where the murder had occurred, and they surrounded it before dawn. He gave orders that every living thing except children should be killed without mercy. He noted that several men tried to escape but were immediately shot. The village was assaulted before any resistance could be prepared. Tsagaan made sure that every soul was either shot or bayoneted, and he claims that no children were found in the village as they had been removed to the forest along with younger women. Tsagaan ordered the burning of all the huts and the razing of banana plantations to the ground. In the center of the village, the mutilated body of the white settler was found, pegged to the ground, disemboweled, and used as a latrine. The raid resulted in 200 Agīkūyū deaths and the capture of 300 cattle and 2,000 sheep and goats.
The Tetu Punitive Expedition.
The Tetu Punitive Expedition was deemed necessary by the British colonial government in 1902 as a response to the murder of a Goan caravan in the Tetu region. The people of Tetu were accused of attacking and killing the Goan traders and looting their goods. The Tetu people refused to pay the fine to the British, sending back the most insolent messages to the government. This defiance led to the decision to launch a military expedition. The Tetu warriors were led by a Muthamaki called Gakere Wanjojo. The government dispatched two-pronged attack on Tetu. Tsagaan led one column from Naivasha, while Balo, Hempstead, and Sub-Commissioner Hind led another from Biri Station, accompanied by Maasai levies, policemen, and Kikuyu collaborators. The expedition involved heavy fighting, confiscation of livestock, and the burning of houses. Tsagaan noted that the Tetu warriors put up a strong resistance, surprising him with their courage. He remarked,
"I must own I never expected the Agīkūyū to fight like this."
Tsagaan was forced to retreat and request reinforcements in form of more than 200 Maasai levies and 140 collaborators from Karuri Wagakure and Wambogo Wamadhagania. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but eventually the Tetu were subdued and forced to sue for peace. Following the punitive expedition, a fort was established in the area and a moat was dug around it, which led to the place being nicknamed Mokaro, meaning the trench. In honor of Gakere's exceptional leadership skills, a road in Nyeri town is named after him. It is said that he was exiled to Kismayu.
The Mathura Punitive Expedition.
The Mathura Punitive Expedition took place between February to March 1904. Tsagaan stated in his Kenya diaries that the punitive expedition was necessary
to put them in the right frame of mind and to show them the flag.
The Mathura were considered to be of doubtful loyalty. The expedition was a three-pronged attack that took place in February and March 1904. One column, led by Tsagaan and Humphrey, consisted of 60 soldiers and 250 Maasai levies, and they moved from Biri Station to Ziba River, scouring the area through Kutus and Kafari to Embu. Two other columns advanced from Nyeri town, one via Mokoroene and the other across Sagana River. The columns thoroughly combed the Mathura region, particularly Konyo and Iriaini, before joining up with the main column. The Mathura expedition resulted in heavy casualties with hundreds of livestock looted, hundreds of warriors killed, and homes razed to the ground. Tsagaan estimated that 1,500 Kikuyu were killed, while the official report from the colonial government listed 400.
The Kini Punitive Expedition.
The Kieni expedition also took place between February and March 1904. Minor Zagen led a column from Fort Hall to surprise the Kieni people. The stated purpose of the expedition was to punish the village for an earlier incident. The expedition involved heavy fighting and the capture of prisoners and livestock, and resulted in a high number of Kikuyu casualties. Minor Zagen actually states in his diary that during the expedition against the Kieni, we killed about 796 niggers, took from the Kieni 782 cattle and 2,150 sheep and goats.
The Decline of Open Warfare, Chapter Number 4.
By the end of 1904, large-scale resistance had been largely quelled. The establishment of administrative posts and military forts, combined with the devastating impact of natural disasters, weakened the Agīkūyū's capacity for organized resistance. The establishment of a viable administration was the immediate concern, but there was no visible traditional authority which to work with. The administrative personnel was also in short supply. The administrative officers therefore turned to mercenaries who had served them as porters, guides, or askaris and created them into chiefs. The officials assumed that chiefs existed in traditional Agīkūyū society, and thus some of the other Maki or any other bold spirits who exaggerated their own importance were made into chiefs as well. The so-called chiefs soon became local tin gods and a law unto themselves, more especially because very little control was exercised over them by the British administrators. These are some of the main chiefs. Karuri Wagakure. He was a key figure who collaborated with the British and played an indispensable role in the subjection of Murang'a and Nyeri districts. He was also instrumental in building up other collaborators and was known to have the ear of the government. He became an enlightened and progressive native, a capable and zealous chief, and a faithful government servant for more than 20 years. It is also noted that he spent his nights at the house of Wangu Wamakeri on his way to Murang'a. Kinyanjui Wagadhirimo or Kinyanjui Nogo. He was initially a poor man who worked as a servant for Waiyaki, a distant relative. He became a main collaborator with the British, particularly with Hall, and was eventually made a paramount chief of the Agīkūyū. He was known for selling other people's land and threatening those who resisted with government reprisal. It is also noted that he was a donkey boy and interpreter at Fort Smith. Other prominent collaborators were Wambogo wa Madhagania and Wang'ombe wa Ihora.
Conclusion.
For the longest time, when I was ignorant of our past history, I always thought that Agīkūyū land was taken over in a few months and not almost 1.5 decades. When I was researching for this video, I was surprised at how slow the progress of colonization was, considering how impatient the British are and the perceived backwardness of the Agīkūyū. So why did it take so long? Hapo sina majibu. This historical record is quite shallow, but at least it offers a brief glimpse of how apparently our ancestors were conquered by the mighty British Empire. Here is a summary of the timeline from when the Agīkūyū encountered the British to the setting up of the colonial administration in Agīkūyū land. Frederick Lugard arrives in Dagoretti and sets up the Kiawariua station. This station operates from 1890 to late 1891. The next station or fort was Fort Smith, which operates from 1891 to 1899, mainly under Francis Hall. Francis Hall finally manages to set up Fort Hall in Murang'a at the end of 1899. Finally, the open warfare in Agīkūyū and Murang'a. The wars between Agīkūyū and colonial administrators between 1890 to 1904 represent one of the most sustained and significant early resistances to British colonial rule in East Africa. For over 14 years, the Agīkūyū people fought against overwhelming military superiority, defending their land, sovereignty, and way of life with remarkable determination. The resistance wasn't simply a series of skirmishes, but a prolonged struggle that forced the British to commit substantial resources and change their colonial strategies multiple times. The brutality of administrators like Francis Hall and Richard Maynard Zagen, who openly advocated for genocide and issued orders to kill every living thing except children, reveals the violent reality of colonial conquest that is often sanitized in historical accounts. Though the British eventually prevailed through superior weaponry, divide and rule tactics, and the exploitation of natural disasters like famine, the spirit of resistance never died. The seeds planted during these early confrontations would later blossom into organized movements like the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, ultimately leading to Kenya's independence in 1963. It is only after the British Empire had taken over our ancestors' physical realm that the next war started being waged. The war of our ancestors' hearts and minds. The missionaries flooded to the pacified Agīkūyū territories with the good news message. The missionaries arrived and set up mission stations to start healing our ancestors from diseases that they themselves had brought into the territory. They also built schools and churches, and these two factories created even more collaborators to sustain the British Empire. By understanding this history, we gain insight into the foundation of modern Kenya and the legacy of colonial trauma that continues to shape society today. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like, subscribe, and share to help spread awareness about these crucial but often overlooked chapters of African history.